Chapter 20. The next day at noon, I was in a rental car. I had reserved an economy car the night before, as I always do. Most of the time, they don't have them, and I get upgraded with no additional charge. Sure enough, when I arrived at the rental company, they gave me a Nissan Maxima with heated seats that were a welcome comfort as I headed north to Westchester County on that bitterly cold day. I crossed out of Manhattan at its northernmost point, took the Sawmill Parkway to Farragut Avenue, and headed west. I picked up Route 9 in Hastings and threaded my way through the river towns. Bounded to the west by the Hudson River, the artery that once gave them life, they are now fed by the Metro North rail line, bringing sustenance in the form of commuters. And thought about how nice it would be to drop off to sleep for a few hundred years. Perhaps I'd awaken in a better world. When I hit Sleepy Hollow, I felt a kinship with Irving's legendary headless rider destined to haunt the woods thereabouts without the wherewithal to see where the hell he was going. Here I was, charging into someone's home and life for no good reason other than to satisfy my own curiosity. I hadn't called Robert Sheehan back the day before, so he didn't know I was coming. I was assuming his daughter was the same girlfriend of Alex's that had killed herself. And while I didn't think a suicide 7 years ago could have anything to do with the recent events in Alex's life, I still wanted a complete picture to understand all the forces that drove Alex away from his family, that ultimately pushed him to tilt at whatever windmill ended up killing him. The girlfriend's death seemed to be the beginning of the wedge between Alex and his family, and perhaps her father could shed some light on how that wedge had been driven in. In Ossining, I turned off of Route 9 away from the river into a neighborhood of small lots and mixed architectural styles where older Tudors and Center Hall colonials sat next to newer McMansions. One street was lined on both sides with identical split levels with one-car garages and hideous bay windows. Sheehan Street, marked by a no outlet sign, was populated exclusively by capes, most of them with sizable renovations to the original cramped design. I turned off the engine in front of Sheehan's house and sat in the car, looking out through rain spatter that was beginning to dot the windshield. Sheehan's house squatted at the 10 o'clock mark of the cul-de-sac, modest and battered, with weathered and warped cedar shakes, the minor addition of 2 dormers, and a ragged lawn enclosed by a sagging split-rail fence. I imagined the neighbors were happy that the house was at the end of the dead-end street, doing as little damage as possible to their own property values. The sky opened up as I left the car and dashed through the frigid drops for the front door, which had no overhang and thus offered no shelter. I pressed the doorbell and heard no ring, so I reached through the aluminum screen door where it was torn on one side, the cracked rubber spline hanging down, and used the knocker, which was dull gray where the brass paint had flecked off. A cold rivulet made its way out of my hair, running past my collar and down my back. As I shuddered involuntarily, the door opened. The man behind the screen looked so little like what I expected after our telephone conversation that I thought I had the wrong house. He was in his mid-60s, around 5 feet 10 inches, clean-shaven, pink-cheeked, with iron gray hair, neatly trimmed and freshly brill-creamed. I could smell the unmistakable barbershop scent of lilac vegetal. Physically robust, he wore sensible brown Oxfords and a flannel shirt tucked into sharply creased khaki pants. The pants were a heavy workman's weight, probably Dickies, not Gap. I had one hand over my head in a futile attempt to catch the larger raindrops. "Mr. Sheehan?" Another 2 drops slithered down my spine before he spoke. Yes, he said. My name is Zachary Brandis. We spoke on the telephone yesterday about Alex Penworth. Another drop ran down my spine. Yes, he said, nodding slightly. Could I talk to you some more? He nodded again, but made no move to open the screen door. Sir, I said, I'm sorry to intrude like this, but it's freezing out here and I'm getting wet. Could I step inside for a moment? He looked up at the sky through the screen, started, and shook himself a little. He put his hand to his mouth and coughed, stamped one foot as if in pain, and then he spoke. Of course, I'm sorry. Please come in. He unlatched the screen door, pushed it open, and stepped to one side. I entered and wiped my shoes on the mat. I'm sorry, he continued slowly. Haven't had many visitors recently. Haven't wanted any, actually, but that's no reason to be rude. He stopped again, standing by the front door. He seemed unsure what to do next, and his eyes cast about the room, looking for help. I waited. When he made no move from the door, I thought I might as well pick up the ball. Could we sit down, Mr. Sheehan? I'd like to talk to you, if I may, about Alex. Certainly. He still didn't move, and so I gestured towards the living room, which opened up to the left of the staircase that faced the front door. He nodded, as if my playing host were the most natural thing in the world. He walked slowly to the one easy chair in the room and sat on its edge. I crossed to the couch, which faced the picture window at the front of the house, taking in my surroundings. The room showed a lady's touch, with framed needlework and cream wallpaper with a pale rosebush and baby's breath pattern. Issues of Ladies' Home Journal and Better Homes and Gardens were neatly stacked under the tables, and antimacassars sat on the easy chair and the couch. On the mantelpiece, a clock with a spinning pendulum sat under a glass dome. The pendulum was still, and the time was wrong. Mr. Sheehan was silent as I examined the room. Is Mrs. Sheehan at home? I asked. Mrs. Sheehan? He looked at me quizzically. No, I'm sorry. I thought you knew. My wife is dead. Evie. She died 3 months ago. Oh, I felt like an idiot. No, I didn't know. Ah, I assumed you did. I mean, I thought you would have, being a friend of Alex's. I'm not, I said. I mean, I wasn't. I didn't know Alex. I only met him twice, briefly. Then why are you here? I'm trying to understand what happened to him. He died, you said. Yes. How? The police are saying it was a suicide. Oh no, he said, and he shrank even further into himself. I never would have told him if I'd known. Evie was right. I never should have told him. Told him what? About the baby. What baby? Did he leave a note? Did he say why he did it? I don't think he did. I mean, I don't think he killed himself. But you just said that the police... Yes, that's what the police are saying, but I don't think that's what it was, and I'm looking into it. Why are you looking into it? He asked, suddenly suspicious. He stood, quickly, with his back to the mantel and crossed his arms. Now he looked wide awake, fully present and slightly menacing. Are you with them? Are you one of them? With who? One of who? Don't fuck with me, he said. He had found his voice completely now, and there was no remaining trace of befuddlement. He was sharp as a tack. "You people have taken enough from me," he said, stepping towards me. "Don't come in here trying to take what little time I have left." And I stood at his approach. "Mr. Sheehan, please, I'm not here for anyone else. I don't know who you're talking about. I'm not part of anything. I promise." He stopped, his hands in fists at his sides. He was still looking at me with mistrust, but he nodded once to himself and stepped back to his chair. He stood before it and fixed me with a glare. "Sit down," he said. I sat. "Start at the beginning," he commanded. "How did you know Alex?" I didn't, really. I knew his roommate, Cynthia. I met them both through a mutual friend, and then Cynthia and I went out on a date, our first date. It sounded lame even as I said it. When I dropped her off that night, the police were there and he was dead. "So that's it? You had one date with his roommate and now you're poking around in it?" I felt stupid. "That about sums it up. Yes." "So what's your interest here? If the police say he committed suicide, what do you care?" "That's a good question. At first, I was just running interference for Cynthia. She didn't believe Alex killed himself, and I thought maybe I could get some questions answered for her. The more I started looking into things, the weirder they became. Now it looks like Alex was mixed up in something that got him killed." "What makes you think that?" he asked. I went through an abbreviated history of what I had discovered so far about Alex's death, the problems with the autopsy, the way he'd been acting before his death, the break-in at his apartment. Sheehan listened attentively, nodding at each of my conclusions. I told him about the peculiar way the cops were acting, my encounter with Sally, the unemployment claim. When I finished, he was silent again. Not the vacant silence he'd been lost in before, but a focused one. I could see him thinking. "How did you find me?" I told him about the phone bills, the call to him, and then all the other calls to Westchester and Putnam counties. "You did a good job," he said. "Thanks," I said. "I mean it," he said. "I was an investigator myself, first in the military during Vietnam and after, and then when I got out of the service for an insurance company. You picked up on the right things, you kept going when you got fed a line of bullshit, and you pulled on all the right threads." I nodded, unsure of what to say. I hadn't thought of myself as running an investigation. I was just gnawing on a bone, scratching an itch. "These phone calls that Alex was making," he continued. "They started when?" "Right after he spoke to you." "So he came up here, and then he got back in touch with them." "It would seem so." Evie was right. I never should have told him. "You said that before, sir. What is it? You never should have told him what?" "My daughter, Megan, was pregnant when she died." He sighed. "When she killed herself. My wife, Evie, didn't want to tell Alex. She felt he had suffered enough, was suffering enough, losing Megan and losing his faith. I thought different. A man should know the truth about what he does, about how it affects other people. I thought he should know he was a father, even if the child was never born. Knowing the truth, facing it, living with it, that's what makes a man. I thought Alex should be given the chance to know. And also, I think I hated him a little for it, blamed him for it. For Megan's death, for all of it. I don't understand. All of what? We had a sweet little girl, a good student, church going. Not that I had anything to do with that. That was all my wife, all Evie. I was rough around the edges. Still am, I guess. But Megan, she was all Evie's. Like this house. He gestured to the room around him, acknowledging with a shrug what I had already noticed, how out of place he looked amidst all the feminine touches. I provided. That was my job. Evie made the home, raised Megan, and then in her senior year of high school, Megan met Alex. That was the beginning of the end, the beginning of our losing her. He took our little girl away from us. He stopped and looked down at his rough hands. Or maybe he didn't take her away, but he started it. I waited, and when he didn't speak, I asked him, how? He introduced her to them, brought her to them. Them? I asked. The atmosphere in the room was suddenly surreal. The last time I heard that word loaded with so much weight and meaning, it had been a little boy screaming in an old science fiction movie. Somehow I didn't think Mr. Sheehan was talking about giant ants, the Wellspring people, Simon, and the rest of them. She was involved with them? She was involved with Alex. She loved him, and she would have gotten involved in anything he was involved in. And he was involved in Wellspring. Yes. Can you tell me about them? What do you want to know? Anything you can tell me. How do they operate? What's their philosophy? Who is this Simon guy, and why do people get involved with him? I don't know much about Simon. I don't know where he came from, but he's got a good line of bullshit, I'll tell you that. I went up there a couple of times to the ashram or whatever the hell they call it. Went up there one Thanksgiving. Must have been close to 40 people there, sitting around after dinner, meditating or something, wearing these funny prayer shawls. I tried to act normal, but it made me real uncomfortable. He had himself a nice thing, people waiting on him hand and foot. He paused again, lost in memory. His line, he said, it was a mix, a grab bag. He talked a lot of Jesus this and Jesus that, but there was also a lot of Eastern crap that I don't know anything about. Reincarnation and that kind of crap. Lots of statues and artwork around that I didn't know what it was. Reminded me of a lot of stuff I'd see when I was on leave in Singapore or Bangkok. How is it that you went up there? Trying to be supportive of my daughter. I didn't want to go. Didn't have any kind of tolerance for that kind of thing. But Evie talked me into it. She said that Megan was rebelling, experimenting, and that if we were supportive, if we weren't too judgmental, she'd find her way back. Evie said if we were intolerant, that would just strengthen Megan's resolve. I tell you, not a day goes by that I don't wish I had drawn a line in the sand. I may have alienated my little girl, but she also might still be alive. Evie might still be alive, too. So when your wife died, you got in touch with Alex? Yes. I thought about it for a while, and then I called him. And when you spoke to him, you told him that your daughter had been pregnant when she died? No. I left a message for him. When he called back, I told him I wanted to see him. I wanted to tell him in person. So he came up here. Yes, he came up here and I told him. He was sitting right where you're sitting now. How did he react? He was real upset, as you can imagine. Kept saying no, 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 said it wasn't possible. But it was. They did an autopsy. I guess they have to with a suicide. It upset Evie real bad. And that was it? You told him and he left? No. He sat there for a while, crying. Then he calmed himself down and asked if he could see Megan's room. Really? Yes. Did you let him? Yes. I didn't see what harm it could do. I was angry at him, sure, but he did love her. I know that. Her death hurt him, too. I know it caused him to lose faith in Simon and all that crap. I might personally think that's a good thing, but I know he was shunned by his family because of it. If he wouldn't have anything to do with Simon, they wouldn't have anything to do with him. So in the end, I know he loved my daughter, and when it came down to it, he stood for the right thing. He could look in her room. I figure he earned that. It's the same as it was when she died. Evie didn't want it touched. She used to go in there. Sometimes she'd just sit. Sometimes I'd see her going through her things. And so he went in there, spent some time. Did your daughter leave a note when she died? I'm assuming she knew she was pregnant. She didn't leave a note, but she did keep a diary of sorts, and we looked at that briefly. We didn't read it all through. It was too hard, but she did know she was pregnant when she died. We sat for a few moments in a silence undisturbed. I looked at the rundown clock on the mantel, and I thought of how the silence must be a comfort to him, that he didn't wind the clock or replace its batteries or whatever it would take, because noise, any noise at all in this silent house, would only serve to remind him of the noises that were no longer present, the voices and day-to-day sounds of his dead wife and daughter. Is there anything else you can tell me about Alex, about Simon? Lots, but I don't know that it will help you. Alex is gone, and from what you say, it sounds like it was something in his new life that killed him. Yes, I think you're right. It's just that it all seems such a waste. He nodded. It is, he said. I stood, and he showed me to the door. Helping me to leave was easier for him than letting me in. Letting the wounds scab over was easier than picking at them. At the door, he took hold of my sleeve between thumb and forefinger. You know, I guess I'm understanding Evie and her feelings about that room a little more. I'd kind of like to have everything around me that I could. Everything that Megan ever touched. I nodded, as if I could even begin to understand his grief. Then he opened the door and pushed open the screen, and I stepped out into the rain. By the time he shut the door behind me, I was already starting to shiver. And that is the end of chapter 20. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel and make sure you click the bell icon so that you get notifications of upcoming live streams. And if you haven't already, head over to my website, MatthewArkin.com. I have a blog there, and you can subscribe to my newsletter, and you'll get articles that I write on acting and writing.